name's John Cordy, and over the past couple of weeks we've been watching Star Wars. So we watched from episode 1 all the way up to last night where we watched episode 9. And actually I didn't hate it as much as I thought I was supposed to. And there was two sort of takeaways from it. The most disappointing thing for me about episode 9 was that Jar Jar didn't come back and sort of have a major influence on that plot. I think that's really the only thing that was missing. And then the other thing was that I recently found out that Jar Jar Binks was actually played by Nicolas Cage, which you might not have known. Interesting, isn't it? Right, anyway, so in this video, the Neural DSP QUAD CORTEX manual dropped last night, so I just wanted to talk quickly about some of the little bits and pieces in there that were interesting to me, since we don't have NAM, since I don't have a physical unit, since I've just done these demos with the Gojira plugin, and I thought, well, I'll just talk about it a bit more. You can get any of the sounds that you hear in this. They're made with, I think, Plini and Gojira, and if you use the Buy Me a Coffee link, you can get those. Just write gotcha with that and I'll send them out to you. First thing that I noticed in the manual, and kind of at the very start of it, there was actually kind of a cool message from Neural DSP saying, basically, you know, we've taken on this challenge and it's been more difficult than we expected, so essentially thank you for your patience, that kind of message, which was cool. And then after that as well, the other thing I noticed was that they've been upfront about saying what the processors they're using are essentially, and what the power is in that structure. If you're interested in that sort of thing, you could probably make some comparisons with things like the AXFX3 or whatever, or the Helix or whatever, and work out for yourself what is more powerful or whatever. I think the AXFX3 has two 1 MHz processors, keystone processors or something. So I guess that's equivalent to the QUAD CORTEX, but I don't know anything about that stuff. The next thing that I noticed was this grid. So the grid is actually the same as the Helix, essentially, where you've got possibility of 8 blocks per line. So you've got signal path 1 and 2 at the top, potentially, signal path 3 and 4 at the bottom. Each of those are sort of separate processing. Like the Helix assigned a DSP chip for the top line and then the bottom line. Neural DSP have done the same thing. But you've got 8 blocks, and then you can drag down and have another 8 blocks, and you can kind of join that one up, same as the Helix. And then underneath that you can have another 16 blocks. I think in terms of dealing with signal flow and signal path and stuff, it's difficult for me to imagine a way that's necessarily kind of better than that, although the fractal grid is also pretty cool as well. The next thing that I noticed was there's a guitar impedance setting, like on the Helix and like on the more expensive Axe-FX stuff, I think. So full Axe-FX, not on FM3. But you can vary the input impedance from 10k to 1 mega ohm. You can do that on the HX Stomp as well, I think. But in terms of making things feel different, that's quite an important setting, as it turns out. I found out from recent kind of experimentation and stuff. As a rule, 1 mega ohm sounds brightest and 10k will sound darkest. And what Helix and Fractal do is they kind of vary the impedance based on, you know, so if it was an arbiter fuzz face or whatever, automatically gets switched down to 10k to respond like the actual pedal. One thing that I really like the look of is this CPU monitor. And so essentially it's showing you how much CPU each of the blocks is taken up. I think that's a really smart idea because, like with anything else, and it is actually said in the manual, you're going to have to make choices with the Neural DSP stuff as well as you do with the Axe-FX or the FM3 or the Helix. There's not unlimited DSP, so you have to kind of make choices about what you're going to do if you want to run, you know, super long chains. To be able to see with the CPU usage monitoring kind of feature what is using most CPU, you know, if you find that you're using an amp and that's actually using, you know, sort of like 50 to 60% of your CPU, maybe you switch that out and find you can then use, you know, more delays or more reverbs or something. I think that's a really novel idea and a decent one. One thing that some other companies should consider doing as well, because it certainly helps me as a user know what I can change and what I could compromise on to do more. The next really big idea and kind of really cool thing I like is this cab view, where you can sort of move microphones around on like a physical display of the speaker. I really like that as an idea, and I think it's a bit different to what most other people have been doing up to this stage, and I think possibly this is going to be one of the big things that Neural DSP sort of introduce. It kind of looks to me as it's like an organic borrowing of lots of ideas within the modelling world, but this particular cab kind of thing is fairly novel and I think fairly new to them. I could be wrong, but I haven't seen other people doing that, certainly not on a modeler yet. In terms of modes, the one that interests me most of all is Scenes mode, which works basically like Snapshots mode rather than like the Scenes mode of the Fractal stuff. So if you're in the Fractal world, in Scenes you can switch between channels on amps, so you could have, you know, up to 4 amps within a preset with gapless switching. You could switch between a deluxe reverb, a rectifier, a triaxis or whatever. You can have 4 channels of amps, and this carries over to every kind of effects block essentially. Whereas in the Helix world, you can change parameters in any block with snapshot changes, but you can't change what that actual block does within the same preset, if that makes sense. So that's one like small difference between Scenes and Snapshots. It looks to me like Neural DSP is closer to the Snapshots, but that is a feature that I use all the time in the Helix, so it's good to see that in the QUAD CORTEX world as well, and being able to change parameters per scene I think is basically essential for me. So I've read through the whole manual, and the last kind of thing that I kind of looked at that I thought was interesting was the capture. Now, although the process looks quite similar to the Kemper, I think what is novel and what is different about the QUAD CORTEX and that you can't do with the Kemper at the moment is that you can combine captures within one preset. So to me this is super powerful. So for instance, there's no reason that you couldn't capture a drive pedal on a Kemper or a direct amp profile with a Kemper. You can do all that, but you can't combine them. So there's no reason particularly that you would bother to capture a drive pedal, because you can't combine it with an amp model to get anything out of it. Whereas with the QUAD CORTEX you can string together captures. So, you know, you could have a tube screamer, then you profile your Mesa Boogie Mark III clean channel and also the drive channel, and you can use all of those together. And I think that's what's novel about the QUAD CORTEX. There's no reason to me that Kemper couldn't do something like that in the future. In terms of architecture and the way they actually lay out their signal chain and stuff, I don't know that they've talked about having the capability to do more than one kind of profile at a time or load more than one profile. So is that ever going to be possible on the Kemper? I don't know. In theory it should be, and I think that would in theory revitalise some of that Kemper stuff. That for me is something that I really like to see from the Kemper, the ability to load kind of dual profiles or whatever would be super cool, and that's what I do like about the QUAD CORTEX. It's kind of mixing a few worlds together, you know, like the modelling, the profiling, and if you can put that all into one signal chain and then do stuff with it, I think that's going to be super powerful and super fun. So that was what I thought was interesting in the manual. Let me know in the comments if you found other interesting stuff. In terms of anything negative, I can't really pick out anything that I don't like about what I've read. In there's a list of AMP models that they've included or are going to include in the first firmware release, and I think there's plenty of choice in there as well, as you'd hope. In general, it's looking good. I don't know what the date is going to be when real people get one of these, but let's see. Thank you for stopping by. If this was at all interesting, you could consider liking or subscribing or whatever. As I say, if you want any of the sounds used in this video, you could use the Buy Me a Coffee link and write gotcha there. And I'll send you my Google Drive, and that's going to be sort of growing as I do more experimentation with the Neural DSP plugins and eventually the QUAD CORTEX. But hopefully this was vaguely interesting, and I'll catch you for another video soon. Cheers.